There's a bottle on almost every table in America that tells you exactly where it came from. Avery Island, Louisiana, 1868. One family, 3 ingredients, 150 years. It's a good story, it's on the label. But 18 years before that date, in a New Orleans newspaper, in January of 1850, somebody was already writing about Tabasco pepper sauce. Not the brand, the sauce. Made by a different man on a different plantation 60 miles down the river. And by the time Edmund McIlhenny sold his first bottle, that other man's family had already been selling theirs for 5 years. So here's the question this episode is actually about. Not who made it famous, we know that answer. Who made it first? Start with the ground, because the ground is the whole story. Avery Island isn't really an island, it's a salt dome. And to understand it, you have to picture something enormous and slow. 200 million years ago, a shallow sea covered this part of the continent. And when it evaporated, it left a bed of solid salt behind. Sediment buried it, mile after mile of mud and sand pressed down on top. But salt under that kind of pressure doesn't crush, it flows. Over millions of years, it pushed back up through the layers above it like a column. And where the column reached the surface, it lifted the land into a hill. That hill is Avery Island. 163 feet above the marsh, the highest point on the entire Gulf Coast. People had been working the brine springs on it since 1791. There is a mountain of salt underneath that pepper field. Remember that, because in about 90 seconds, it's going to matter more than the peppers do. In 1862, men deepening one of those brine springs hit something 16 feet down. Not brine, solid rock salt. The first rock salt discovery in North America. The timing could not have been worse or better, depending on which side you were on. Because in 1862, salt was not a seasoning, it was ammunition. Salt is how an army preserves meat, and an army that can't preserve meat can't march. The Confederacy was desperately short of it, and had just found the largest deposit on the continent. Production went from a few hundred tons a year to tens of thousands. By some accounts, more than 1,000 bushels a day. Wagon teams backed up hundreds deep, waiting to load. Men worked the face in shifts around the clock. And here is the part of this that has to be said plainly, because it is documented and because leaving it out would be a lie of omission. This was a slave plantation, and the salt was mined by enslaved people, under armed military guard, to make war material. That is not a footnote to the story of this island. For those years, it was the story of this island. And I want to say one thing about how we're handling that, and then we'll carry on. There's a difference between recognizing what happened and reliving it. Every history has bruises and scars on it, and this one has plenty. But you don't get to tell the story of this island honestly and leave that part in the dark. So we put a little sunlight on those shadows, we look at them, and we let them remind us we can do better. I'm a chef, not a historian. All I can give you is what the record shows. I hope I've given it the reverence it's owed, and no disrespect to anybody. Now, back to the story. The Union tried to take it by water in November of 1862 and were driven off. They came back overland the following April 1863, and this time nobody stopped them. They burned the works to the ground, the buildings, the engines, the winches, and 600 barrels of salt sitting on the dock waiting to ship. The Avery family had already run for Texas. They came home in 1865 to a wrecked plantation, a burnt salt works, and a labor system that had just been destroyed by law. The story you'll usually hear next is a comeback story. A ruined banker, a hard winter, a lucky pepper. And it's true as far as it goes. But keep one thing straight, They did not start from nothing. They started from land and from a mountain of salt. The origin story, as the company tells it, goes like this. A returning traveller hands McIlhenny a handful of pepper pods. He plants them on the island. In 1868, he grows his first commercial crop. And the year after, 1869, he sells his first bottles. 658 of them, $1 apiece, wholesale, mostly to grocers in New Orleans. He packs them in cologne bottles he got from a New Orleans glass supplier, corked and sealed in green wax, because the sauce was concentrated enough that you were meant to sprinkle it, not pour it. Now, almost every piece of that is on the company's own record, and nothing contradicts it. But notice what the story doesn't have: a name. Who was the traveller? The company's own historian describes him as an ex-Confederate coming back from Mexico. Other versions call him a soldier. Some name him, some don't. The company's website today doesn't say at all. And there's something stranger, which I'll flag as unconfirmed because I want you to hold it loosely. As far as I can find, Edmund McIlhenny never mentioned the source in his own autobiographical sketch. It didn't appear in his obituaries either. The man who founded one of the most recognized products on Earth apparently didn't consider it the most interesting thing about himself. So let's go to the paper, because there is one document from the beginning of this that isn't a story anybody is telling. It's a filing. United States Patent number 107701. Improvement in pepper sauce. Granted the 27th of September 1870. And it does not describe the sauce you think it does. Here's what's actually in it. Ripe peppers mashed to a pulp, a pint of vinegar and a handful of salt per gallon. Covered and left 6 weeks, not 3 years. Worked through a sieve. And then this, bisulfate of lime, 1 drop per ounce, which is a preservative. It's in there for one specific purpose, and the patent says so, to stop the mixture from fermenting. Sit with that a second. The sauce in your refrigerator is made by fermentation. 3 years of it in oak. The process Edmund McIlhenny actually patented was engineered to prevent the exact thing the modern sauce is built on. There are no barrels in that patent, not one. The company used stoneware jars for the first 30 years, and I went looking for the year the barrels arrived, and I could not find it. No source I trust puts a date on when fermentation replaced the chemistry, so I'm not going to invent one. The 3-ingredient, 3-year oak barrel sauce is real. It's just not what he patented. It's what the thing became. 60 miles down the Mississippi from Avery Island, at a place called Deer Range Plantation, there was a man named Colonel Maunsel White. Irish-born, New Orleans merchant, planter, legislator, and a grower of peppers. On the 26th of January 1850, 18 years before McIlhenny's first crop, a letter ran in a New Orleans newspaper, the Daily Delta, crediting White with introducing to the South what it called the celebrated Tabasco red pepper, the very strongest of all peppers. That's not a legend, that's a dated newspaper in print in 1850. And the letter describes his method. He boiled the peppers, then poured strong vinegar over them. White died in 1863, and beginning in 1864, 5 years before Edmund McIlhenny sold his first bottle, his heirs were advertising a product called Maunsel White's Concentrated Essence of Tabasco Pepper. There's even an account of a steamship menu from 1879 still offering Maunsel White sauce among its relishes, a full decade after McIlhenny entered the market. I've only found that one in a single source, so hold it loosely. So the obvious question, did one of these men get it from the other? And here I have to be careful, because this is genuinely unsettled, and there are real people with real credentials on both sides of it. The botanist and food historian Jean Andrews argued that White personally gave McIlhenny both pepper pods and his recipe, the two men being friends shortly before White died. She cited testimony given in the United States Circuit Court in 1922. The McIlhenny Company's own historian, Dr. Shane Bernard, and he's a credentialed historian, not a marketing department, says flatly that there is no contemporary historical evidence that Edmund McIlhenny ever knew Maunsel White. And Bernard makes a second point that isn't just a company deflection. It's technical and it's fair. White boiled his peppers. McIlhenny fermented his. Those are not the same source. They're not even the same category of process. So I'm not going to tell you Edmund McIlhenny stole anything because I can't prove it, and neither can anyone else. Here's what I can tell you, and it's enough. He was not the first person in Louisiana to grow Tabasco peppers. He was not the first to make a sauce from them. He was not the first to call it Tabasco. And he was not the first to sell it. Another family beat him to market by 5 years, and the newspaper that proves it is 19 years older than his first bottle. He wasn't first. He was the one who lasted. And while we're pulling on threads, there's one more, and it goes further down than the source. The name. Tabasco is a state in Mexico. That much is easy. So the assumption everybody makes is that the pepper came from there, and the sauce was named for the place. Except the peppers may not have. Botanists don't actually agree on where Capsicum frutescens originates. Some trace it to the Amazon basin and Bolivia, some to southern Mexico and Central America, and the sources genuinely contradict each other. There's no settled homeland, and it gets better because the state's own name is disputed by its own historians. One school traces it to Nahuatl, a phrase meaning something like the place of damp earth. Another traces it to the name of a Chontal Mayan chief. There is no consensus in Mexico about what Tabasco means either. So here's where that leaves us. A source named for a place the pepper might not be from, using a word nobody can definitively translate, made by a man who probably wasn't the first to make it. Every single layer of the origin story is softer than the label suggests. That's not a scandal. That's just what happens when you actually check. Whatever the source was in 1870, here's what it turned into. The peppers are still grown on the island, and they're still picked by hand because of a piece of equipment I genuinely love. Every picker carries a small wooden stick, painted a very specific shade of red. Le petit bâton rouge, the little red stick. You hold it up against the pepper, and if the color doesn't match, you leave it on the plant. The company will tell you no machine has ever been built that can judge ripeness as well as a person holding a painted stick. I can't independently verify that claim. What I can tell you is they're still using the stick. The mash goes into white oak barrels, used bourbon barrels, bought second-hand from distilleries around the country. You'll read that they're Jack Daniel's barrels specifically. The company doesn't say that, they just say bourbon. The char gets scraped out of the staves, the barrel gets rehooped in stainless, and then the top is sealed, not with a lid, but with a thick cap of rock salt from the island's own dome. As the mash ferments, it produces gas, and that gas pushes up through the salt and escapes. The salt hardens into a solid crust. By the time the barrel is opened 3 years later, that crust has become a seal. Salt from the mountain underneath, sealing the pepper grown on top of it. That's not a marketing line, that's just how the thing works. 3 years, then 28 days blended with vinegar, then a strainer, then a bottle. It got out fast. By the winter of 1873 into 74, it was shipping to England and France. A Louisiana pepper sauce, made on a salt dome in a swamp. crossing the Atlantic within 5 years of its first sail. But the thing that really moved it wasn't a grocery order. It was an army. You'll hear that families mailed it to soldiers in both world wars. I couldn't verify that, so I'm leaving it as a story. What is documented starts in Vietnam. In 1966, a Marine, a McIlhenny himself, Edmund's grandson, put together something called the Charlie Ration Cookbook. It was a genuine, practical, slightly absurd little book about making sea rations edible in the field. And it was built around the source. It shipped with a bottle. There's a Marine remembered in the accounts only as Tabasco Mac, who's credited with pushing it into the rations in the first place. I couldn't establish his real name. Sea rations became MREs in 1981. And by the Gulf War in 1990, the little bottle was official, an issued component of a United States military meal. Which means a sauce a Louisiana planter's family patented in 1870 is now government equipment. And then there's the one that got away, and then didn't. A man named B.F. Trappy worked for the McIlhenny Company. Around 1898 he left and started his own pepper sauce business in New Iberia, growing his peppers, by every account, from Avery Island seed stock. You can imagine how that went over. What followed was decades of trademark litigation over one word: Tabasco. A word that is, after all, a Mexican state. McIlhenny registered it federally in 1906. The fight ran through the federal appeals courts in 1922, twice in the same year, and dragged on for decades after that. McIlhenny ultimately won the exclusive right to the name. Though I'll note there are legal historians who think there wasn't much basis for anybody to own that word in the first place. But here's the ending nobody tells you. In 1991, quietly, the McIlhenny Company bought Trappy's outright. The rival became a subsidiary, and 6 years later, in 1997, they sold it off again. Trappy's is still on shelves today. It's owned by a food conglomerate now, and it isn't made in Louisiana anymore. It's made in Colombia. One more thing, and it's the question under all of this. Why does a pepper hurt? Because it's supposed to, and not to you specifically. The compound is capsaicin, and it doesn't damage anything, it lies. It binds to a receptor in your mouth called TRPV1, which is the receptor that detects actual heat, real physical temperature. Capsaicin fits into it and triggers it, and your brain is told the inside of your mouth is burning. Nothing is burning. It's a chemical picking a lock. But here's the part I find genuinely beautiful. That lock is only in mammals. Field research on wild peppers found the reason. A mammal that eats a pepper grinds the seeds up in its molars and destroys them. A bird swallows them whole, flies and drops them somewhere else intact. Birds don't have the same receptor. Capsaicin does nothing to them at all. So the pepper isn't defending itself from being eaten, it's choosing who eats it. It evolved a chemical that says no to mammals and nothing at all to birds, and it has been running that strategy for millions of years, which makes every one of us a rounding error in the pepper's plan. And the scale everyone quotes, the Scoville scale, is younger and squishier than people think. Wilbur Scoville came up with it in 1912, and the original method was to dilute the pepper in sugar water until a panel of human tasters stopped being able to feel it. It was a taste test. As for why anyone volunteers for this, psychologists have a name for it: benign masochism. Your body reports danger, your mind knows there isn't any, and the gap between those two things is pleasure. It's a roller coaster for your tongue. Edmund's son was named Edward Avery McIlhenny. Everybody called him Ned. And in the 1890s, he noticed something that most people at the time were choosing not to. The snowy egret was disappearing. Not from disease, from hats. The plume trade, feathers for women's fashion, had hunted the birds to the edge of extinction across the Gulf, because the most valuable plumes were the ones the birds grew during breeding season, which meant you shot them on the nest. So Ned McIlhenny went out into the marsh and found 8 chicks in 2 nests. 8. He brought them back to the island, built them a flying cage, and raised them by hand. That autumn he let them go. The next spring, 6 of the 8 came back. They paired off, they nested, and they brought others. By 1911, 16 years later, by his own count, the colony on Avery Island held 100,000 birds. That's his estimate, not an audited census, and I'll flag it as his. Theodore Roosevelt is said to have called it the most noteworthy reserve in the country. Between 1912 and 1942, Ned McIlhenny personally banded 286,743 birds. He kept the records himself, and he didn't stop at the island. He brokered land deals that put roughly 174,000 acres of Louisiana coastal marsh into permanent protection. He wasn't a saint. He gets blamed for turning nutria loose in Louisiana, which is a real ecological catastrophe. Although as far as the record shows, he was neither the first to farm them nor the first to release them. But the family that built an empire on a pepper, also on the same ground, in the same generation, pulled a species back from the edge. Both of those are true. Neither one cancels the other. One last thing, because if you're from Louisiana, you've been shouting it at the screen for 20 minutes. Tabasco is not the only hot sauce in this state. It isn't even, by a lot of people's reckoning, the one Louisiana actually eats. In 1923, a man named Alvin Bormer bought a struggling snowball syrup company in New Orleans and found a hot sauce recipe sitting in its files. He pivoted the entire business around it and called it Crystal. For decades, its factory on Tulane Avenue wore a giant illuminated sign of a chef stirring a pot that you could see from the interstate. Hurricane Katrina wrecked the plant in 2005. They moved production, rebuilt, and put the sign back up. And in 1928, in New Iberia, the same parish as Avery Island, a family operation that became Bruce Foods started selling a sauce out of a home kitchen and became the first brand to put the state's own name on the bottle. Ask around down here and people will tell you Crystal outsells Tabasco inside Louisiana. I've seen that said a lot, and I couldn't find a hard number to prove it, so I'll say it the honest way. It is widely believed, including by people who'd know, which sets up the only question that actually matters at the end of this. So pick the bottle back up. Avery Island, Louisiana. It's true, there is a mountain of salt under that field, and the salt was worth killing for before the pepper was worth anything at all. There is a stick painted a specific red. There are barrels sealed with the island's own salt, sitting in the dark for 3 years. And there's a date on the label that's honest as far as it goes, and a New Orleans newspaper from 1850 that quietly says somebody else got there first. The sauce that won wasn't the first sauce. It was the one that had a salt mine, a patent, a family that outlasted its lawsuits, and 150 years of not stopping. Being first is a fact. Lasting is a strategy. Before anything else, the free one. Air Fry Rescue, my air fryer book, is free. And if you cook the way this island cooks, cast iron, open fire, something that actually sizzles, Hand Me Down is the cast iron book. Both linked below. Coming up, we're going somewhere the food came before the flag did. There's a word you know that means pirate. And before it meant pirate, it was a wooden rack for smoking meat over a slow fire. The men who used it sold provisions to passing ships. Robbing them came later. They were cooks first. That one's coming. Now, the war. And in Louisiana, this one is real. You know what it is. Tabasco or crystal. One of them is on every table on earth. The other one is on more Louisiana tables than the famous one is. And everybody in this state knows it. Pick one. Name your parish. And if somebody from your own parish tells you you're wrong, take it up with them, not me.